People.
Everyone.
Whoa! Wow.
Hey, that thing works, doesn't it?
I don't know what to do after that. Welcome, everyone, to the March 14th City Council work session. It's showtime. We have a little business to do at the beginning of the meeting that is left over from last night's public hearing on the Metro Plan boundary adjustment proposal. Emily, you want to?
So by the end of the meeting, we didn't have quorum to take action. Springfield and Lane County both took action to leave the record open in that matter until 5 o'clock on March 27th. We recommend that you do the same thing, so the record is the same for all jurisdictions. So that's what you have in front of you.
Regarding the Metro Plan boundary adjustment proposal for the Springfield side of I-5, I move to leave the record open until 5 p.m. on Tuesday, March 27th.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Questions? All right. All those in favor, please indicate. 7 in favor and none in opposition. It passes. Thank you. Okay. Now we're on to sort of a huge nexus point in our Envision Eugene work that's been going on now for
A while.
Multiple months.
and I'm going to hand it over to you, City Manager, but I do want to acknowledge all the folks in the room and many of them who have labored long and hard on this, and I know you'll mention that too, but we'll just start out the meeting by saying thank you to all the citizens who've been involved. Thank you to our staff. Thank you for the leadership that you've also shown in this issue, and now we're ready to turn it over.
Well, thank you, Mayor. And, I'll be giving a presentation via PowerPoint. Before I do that, I also would like to just acknowledge some people that are in the room. First of all, just as you know, we've talked about this a lot. We do have an extremely talented staff here in Eugene. We're very fortunate to have that. Lisa and her team have, I think, done just yeoman's work over the last few years and have worked extremely hard to get us to the place where we are now. And it's unimaginable the amount of effort that it takes to get to a place like this. And so Lisa has shown tremendous leadership in that. And this is one of those things that if you're a planner, it'll be a milestone in their career going forward, just this whole effort. And so they've done extremely well at that. And we also have had an extremely dedicated community, as you know. It's one of the hallmarks of Eugene that you don't have in other communities, at least in my experience, is people that are willing to devote the amount of time and hours and effort in a whole lot of things in this community. In this particular project, literally hundreds and thousands of hours going from very much at the a large strategic level down into lots and lots of detail. And so we are also very fortunate to have some people in this community that are willing to do that. And so I thank them also. What you're going to see today, I don't think there's going to be any major surprises for you. We've been talking about this for months, a couple of years. We've been coming back on an ongoing basis. And so I don't anticipate anything that you see in here is just going to be shocking or something you haven't already seen. And we're trying to bring it all together. And this is not the end of the journey. It really is sort of the beginning of a vision, but also continuing discussion. And what's going to get the most play right now will be, so how many acres are you really wanting to expand for the UGB? And as you'll see, my recommendation will include expanding some for the UGB. And that's going to get all the energy for right now. But really, this is much more than a line on a map. This really has become what we hope is a future for Eugene in the next 20, 30, or 40 years. And so while that's where the energy will be today, in tomorrow and next month and next year, the real energy will need to be on how do we create that future and how do we implement the strategies to get there. So that's going to be important. The other piece I need to also say is this is not John's vision. This is not my vision of what the community needs to be or should be into the future. The approach that we have taken is to listen and to learn, and then try to, from the collective wisdom in the community and all those conversations, really try to reveal what we hope is a vision that represents the best outcomes for many, many people in this community. So this is not John's vision of the future of Eugene. One other thing before I get started, I want to just talk a little bit about balance. What we are trying to do is balance a lot of different outcomes, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different needs, a lot of different approaches. And so when we go through this, it's not about priorities, it's about balancing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's get started. Here's the 4 things that we'll talk a little bit about today. We're not asking you to take any action today. This will be my recommendation, and I'll talk a little bit about next steps as we move towards the end of the conversation. Of course, we are here to answer questions at any varying level of detail that you would like to. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the mandate and the opportunities that we have, a little bit about a process, and we purposely chose a different path, the recommendations, and then a little bit around the next steps. So let's talk initially about the mandate and the opportunities. As you remember, through House Bill 3337, essentially the state mandated us to take a look at creating a new urban growth boundary, a Eugene-only urban growth boundary, to accommodate what we are projecting as 34,000 people in the next 20 years. And really what it says is we have to accommodate that growth through various land uses, family, single-family, multi-family lands, housing lands, as well as industrial and commercial. But what we discovered, or what we quickly transformed into, is this is really more than a mandate. It's really an opportunity to discover a 20 or 30-year vision for Eugene. And that's really where we've taken it from here. What you see there is just a partial piece of the community resource group who earlier on spent lots of time helping to create that vision through what we called the 7 pillars. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. I want to talk a little bit about the current reality. One of the balances that we do use is the triple bottom line. You're familiar with that from an economy, social equity, and environmental standpoint. And here's a couple of graphs that have meaning to us when we think about what is the current reality that we find ourselves in. This is employment trends over the last many years. If you were to go all the way back, starts back in 1990. Currently, as of most recent, our unemployment here came in at 8.8%, which compared to the last couple of years is doing better, but it's not as good as we hope to be. But what you see from this trend here really is Eugene and Springfield generally matches the Oregon unemployment rate, but we're higher than the U.S. generally when you start back, on the left side of the graph. You can see where the lines kind of cross there. And so one of the things that we talk about, the current reality in our economic situation is generally Eugene is a bit lower than the state, and then it's also, or a bit higher than the state, but also higher than the national average. This is the graph that actually has a lot of meaning to me. It talks about our real average annual wages, and real just means that it's adjusted for inflation. And what this says here is, as you go all the way back into the mid-70s, the gap between Lane County and the rest of Oregon, and if you take a look at even more specifically in the Eugene-Springfield area, you see the same trend, is the difference in wages over the last 30-plus years is our average median income, our average wages are anywhere from 10, 15, 17+% less than the state average. Remember during the budget, one of the markers that I always like to use around fiscal stewardship is that one that talks about reserve for revenue shortfall, our savings account. And I think that's a nice measure of financial stewardship. This is, to me, a measure of prosperity in the community that says, for a long time, we've been entrenched in this gap. And it says to me is we can't we can't ignore that. The no alternative or not doing anything is not an option for us. Part of what we need to do is to try to close that gap. From a social equity standpoint, I'll let you read through some of the statistics here. But it talks about that while we do have a lot of people in this community that prosper, and we have a very nice quality of life in this community. It's a fabulous community to live in. In some ways, it's easy to live in. But it also says that there are people in this community that face various financial hardships that we also have a responsibility to think about. And part of what we've wanted to do through Envision Eugene is try to address some of these as well. And so you can take a look at 60% of children in the Bethel School District are on free and reduced lunches, are eligible for that, 40% in the 4J. Homeless count back January 2011 was over 2,000 people in Lane County on that evening. 34% of our households are only able to pay 1 month or less of bills if their main source of income stops. And what that means is if they lose their job, they don't have the savings account to pay their bills. So we do have some of these social equity indicators that we're also concerned about. Housing affordability, you can take a look at that. Essentially what that says is real income for folks over the last 30 years has grown by 6%. That's not an annual figure. It's grown by 6% difference. Yet the rent and then the home values have gone up multiples of that. I think the last one is a bit telling. It says nearly 45% of households have a housing cost burden, and a housing cost burden says that if you're having to pay more than 30% of your income on your house or your housing costs, you're considered cost burden from a federal guidelines perspective. And we have 45% nearly in that situation back in 2010. On the environmental side, it's a little bit different, interesting. Here's just to show a little bit of our action plan goals coming out of our climate and energy work. You know, and we've talked about these, of reducing greenhouse gas and fossil fuel use, and really to kind of adapt and be resilient to changes that would be anticipated through climate change or as fossil fuel prices increase. The good news is, if you look at these graphs, we're using significantly less energy than we did several years ago, and so the trend on these graphs are going in the right direction. And so part of what we want to do through Envision Eugene is continue to implement strategies that maintain this trend and continue, in some cases, to accelerate the trend, but to at least maintain this trend. And so part of what Envision Eugene is talking about is taking a look at the environmental, social equity, and economic current reality that we have going on. Some additional community goals when we talk about, from an environmental standpoint, water quality, critical habitats, farm and forest lands. We want to protect and maintain those kinds of things as we go forward, which has been a community value for us for a long time. I want to talk just a little bit about the process because we did choose a different path. And we've been successful, but not 100% successful in achieving what we hoped we would achieve going down this path. A big portion of this was to move beyond what has traditionally been a growth, no growth contest in the community. And that's been around for decades. And one of the ways that we really wanted to do that is rather than set us up in a situation where we dig in our heels and eventually try to compromise our way through that, what we said is let's not do that. Let's really focus on our best outcomes and try to find a third place to land. And so it's not about compromising, it's finding a third place to land that starts to meet all of our best outcomes. And we've tried very hard to do that. Again, I don't think we've been 100% successful in that, but we've come a long way in doing that. And we've really focused on our best outcomes, not our worst fears. So many times in a community, it's very easy to get wrapped up in what we don't want and implement strategies and take actions to prevent things that we're fearful of, as opposed to really naming and identifying our best outcomes and then aligning behind those. And we've tried to do that. We've also said that this isn't about one or two or a few perspectives. We have worked hard at trying to get a collective wisdom of a community in forming these recommendations. Not everybody will agree with the recommendations. We wouldn't expect that. Not everybody will feel like they've been listened to, but I believe we have listened. We understand, and in some cases we just don't agree. But we have listened, and we have been trying to work through a collective wisdom. We're focusing on tomorrow. We're not saying that we need to repeat what happened yesterday and hope for the best. If we repeat what happened yesterday, some of the graphs around economic development, some of the graphs around social equity don't change. And so we really need to focus on tomorrow and the best outcomes for achieving those. We set it up as a balanced as opposed to a priority. We haven't said that economic is more important than social equity, or social equity is more important than environmental. We've said we have to balance all of those as we move forward. And we talk about the 7 pillars, it's the same thing. We need to balance all of those pillars. For different people in the community, some of those have a higher priority for them, or they have more energy around those. The plan that we're recommending is trying to balance those. And we've invited everybody to be at the table. If you were involved at all in the CRG meetings, as you know, it was open to anybody that chose to come. We invited some and kept it open for those that chose to come. We have had multiple opportunities for people to weigh in. We did not purposefully try to create a small committee to work through all of this. And that last one, Chris Pryor introduced this to me a couple months ago, puzzle versus mystery, and as it turns out, I only have to attribute it to you for 3 times, and then I can go ahead and take it myself. This is the second time I've attributed it to you, so I got one more to do. I think it's just, the more I think about it, it's just such an interesting concept, and really what, as I understand this, is when we think about a puzzle, we think about a jigsaw puzzle, where you have it before you, and what you really need to do is find the pieces to put into the puzzle, and then the puzzle reveals the picture. The mystery is a little bit different, more like a Sherlock Holmes story, where all the pieces are there, and what you really need to do is think about it, work through it, use your wisdom to actually reveal what's there. We've done a little bit of both for this. We have collected much information, much data. There are people in this room that could go down lot by lot on some of this information, and it's all been needed. We're also at the point, I think, of revealing the mystery, and that's what we're trying to do. In a broad sense, these are some of the best outcomes that we've said we want to try to achieve. And this goes back to the current reality. Employment opportunities, prosperity. If we're able to close that gap on economic opportunities, that real wage gap, just think of the opportunity that people have. It impacts our housing, impacts our social services, impacts people's prosperities. It makes a huge difference in this community going forward. We also want to assess housing opportunities and try to get past that 44% of people that are cost burdened by their housing costs. Access to a variety of services, transportation, educational opportunities. School districts are interested in what we do here. And then making Eugene livable for everyone, that everybody has access to opportunities. So as you move into the recommendation, I'll kind of go from large down into small, and I really will get to the point where everybody wants to be at how many acres and where they're going to be. So I'm just trying to set the stage that that's not the only part that's important in this. It's one piece, but it's really not the most important piece. Again, it's based on collective wisdom. We're trying to balance it and then align it, not only behind the triple bottom line, but if you think about the goals that you have adopted and the vision that you have adopted and outcomes that are over on the wall, we're also trying to align behind on those as well. We do acknowledge that the future is unknown. And while we don't call things the jaws of uncertainty, which Alan introduced to us
That's yours now.
many months. Oh, that was the third time, Alan. The jaws of uncertainty, but I think the basic principle is exactly where we've tried to be, that says We are making some recommendations on the best information we have at the moment. At this point in time, at this snapshot, things are going to change. We need to adapt. We need to analyze. We need to monitor. And we have to change and be resilient as we go forward as those things change. And so we're acknowledging that we don't have all the answers today, but we need to continue to monitor and be willing to make adjustments. We're focusing on the best outcomes. We're trying not to prevent worse fears. We're trying to say, where do we want to be in the best outcomes? And we're being aggressive but realistic. We want to try to achieve some things that maybe are a stretch for us, but we also want to be reasonable and realistic in trying to achieve those. We said we want to protect neighborhood livability. And here are some of the pieces as when we get into the pillars and some of these kinds of things. The CRG had lots of conversation around these kinds of things. And while it feels like they're just statements being thrown out there, what we're really trying to do is set a path for the future of this community. And what we've said is protecting neighborhood livability is a prime piece for us as we move forward. What that really means, as we'll talk about more, is we're just not going to load up neighborhoods with a lot more density and people. We're not going to load all our neighborhoods up with future growth. We're going to focus growth, though, along transit corridors and core commercial areas. We really do want to focus growth in. We do want to become more urbanized and compact. And the way we want to do that for growth is to take a look at transit corridors and core commercial areas, and we'll talk more about that. We also want to support development where we want it. So what that means is rather than just sort of randomly, whether it's applying incentives, whether it's working through codes and all of those things that will have to happen, let's make sure we're focusing those on where we want different types of development to occur, and let's encourage that, let's support that, let's enable that to happen. And that's going to be important for us. And then we've also said we need to protect farmland and natural resources. Those are community values, high community values for us here in Eugene, and so we want to continue to protect those. We also want to try to address some of those long-standing economic, social equity, and environmental issues. Let's reuse what we already have, but be realistic, and what that means is rather than just abandoning everything we have and bumping everything outside the UGB, there are some things that we can redo, redesignate, rezone, relook at, try to use those. But there are times that it's probably not realistic, and so we have to try something different. Build on existing work. We're not starting from scratch. There's been work done in this community over the last many years, whether it's the Climate Energy Action Plan, whether it's some of the downtown plans, whether it's rivers to ridges. There's a lot of work that's been done. Let's build on that, not recreate that and throw it out. And then lastly, be adaptable and flexible. Let's recognize that we're going to need to continue to change as we move forward. Staff's recommendation has been informed by thousands and thousands of hours of work that's gone on in this community in a whole lot of different forms. Talk briefly about the CRG. The Technical Resource Group, which has been a subset of the Community Resource Group, has done amazing amounts of detailed work to help inform this recommendation. And they have vetted through many of the numbers. Not all that you see has been vetted through with the Technical Resource Group. This is not their recommendation. It's not the CRG recommendation. It's my recommendation. But they have spent lots of time working through lots of things in a pretty amazing way. So, the pillars you've seen. And the reason why I want to put these up here is, again, it's about balance. It's about trying to achieve balance in the triple bottom line. It's about balancing all of these pillars. For some, they will have a higher priority, but we're trying to balance them. I'm going to walk through each pillar and talk about each one. These goals from an economic development standpoint, economic opportunity, really come through that JEO plan. Talks about unemployment rate. We need to keep reducing that below the state average. And the bottom one there, the second one, to me has as much meaning as any, is that increasing the average wage to at least meet the state average and create the opportunity for that. So here's some key strategies, and we'll get into some more specifics. Implement the JEO Regional Prosperity Economic Development Plan. That will continually be updated, refreshed as new information comes in, so that will be important. We're going to meet our commercial need within the existing urban growth boundary. What that means is don't expand for commercial land in and of itself. We want to consolidate and redevelop vacant lands and develop sites. There are sites inside brownfield sites, for example, that we should spend some time. They won't be easy, but we should spend some time doing that, reusing some of what we already have. Recommendation does include expanding for industrial sites. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then also, any lands that we expand for, particularly for industrial, it needs to stay as industrial land. So we need to protect it and not have it become rezoned later on because there's some other use that happens to come up. If it's important to us, we need to keep it that way, and that's what that last one says. So here's with the job growth rate. And when we finish, if you have detailed questions on a lot of this, there's people in the room that can go into lots of detail. You might remember the safe harbor up really until 6 months or so ago was 0.88%, and that's what we've been using for projected job increase. Recently, the state came out with a safe harbor at 1.66, and if you remember what the safe harbor says, it says you pick a safe harbor, you're safe, meaning people just can't appeal that by right, and so you could pick either one of those and move forward. It makes a difference when you do that at how many jobs are anticipated to come in with growth. One of the interesting pieces is we talk about 34,000 people coming in, but we're talking nearly 36,000 jobs into the future using this 1.4, and I'll talk about that in a minute. What that says is we're, and we know this, we're a regional job center. People come here to work. They don't always live here, but they come here to work, and so we're going to have more jobs and people as part of this growth. The concern we have with both of the safe harbors, and you can kind of look at the bullets, are, remember we're looking at a 20-year forecast. This really is a 10-year forecast. The 1.66 particularly also talks about catching up from some of the past recession, which is great, but maintaining that rate out into the future is probably unrealistic. We'll move through this period, we'll grow to a certain place, and then I guess we wouldn't anticipate us continuing to growing at that. It probably starts to grow at a decreasing rate. So the 1.66 feels just too high to us. Same with on the low side, 10-year forecast does not really reflect us as a regional job center or growth coming out of the recession. So that feels too low. The 1.4 is for us seems much more a reasonable long-term outlook. And again, if you want to get into some more detail, we have people that can talk about the detail. But so the recommendation is a 1.4%, and that will translate into a couple things here in a minute. With that, we anticipate 91% of the projected job growth will occur inside the UGB. One of the things I want to talk about as we move through here, and I'll talk about it when we talk about actual acres of land. Well, I'll wait till I get there because that happens, the note that's down there, the asterisk, we'll talk a little bit about that. We've said 100% of the new commercial jobs, nearly 100% of new government jobs, and what that means is you'll see later on we're recommending expansion for Bethel School District. And so people that work out at Bethel School District on the new land will be government employees. And so there are some government employees that would be outside the urban growth boundary. And that approximately 72% of the new industrial jobs would occur inside. So remember, part of our goal still is to be creating density, reusing what we have, and then what is reasonable, let's do that. But when it becomes beyond what feels realistic, we're going to have to bump a few things out. You haven't really seen, you've seen this display, not so much on the commercial jobs, but it's really the same concept. You can see there, commercial jobs, 21,450 jobs in the next 20 years. If you take a look at the existing capacity inside the UGB, there are vacant lands in which commercial would be built on. Partially vacant land, that means there's actually a building on there, but you can build more buildings on there. Existing building space, that would be an example like Taco Time building downtown. It's being redone. It's existing space, but it'll have some commercial in it. I want to talk a little bit about baseline redevelopment and then the boost of redevelopment on the others, on the far side of that. The baseline redevelopment says is if we don't do anything, just let the natural flow of events occur in the redevelopment of existing land, we could get about 2,700 jobs out of that. On the boost redevelopment, on the far side of that, the bars down below, what that means is we're going to proactively need to do something. It may be targeted incentives. It may be assembly of land. It may be all infrastructure. It's all those kinds of things, those strategies that we're going to have to implement in order to capture those kinds of jobs. If we don't, as we go through the monitor and the analysis, if it turns out that we're not capturing those kinds of things, we're going to have to go back and take a look at land supply. So it's important that we implement these strategies. Displaced capacity to others, what that means is there are certain lands that were commercial that, was it towards multifamily or?
Multifamily.
Multifamily that, as part of our multifamily equation, will get redesignated as multifamily land, which means they're not available commercial, so you have to add those back into the equation, which is really what that's doing now. And then expand flexibility means certain kinds of land, for example, some of the industrial lands, very small parcels, we make those also available for commercial. We're creating new capacity in the urban growth boundary. So there's existing, and then there's new capacity that we'll create inside the urban growth boundary. It's not a lot laissez-faire new capacity. We're going to be having to implement strategies as we go to create that. But with all of that, what we've said is we don't need to expand the urban growth boundary for commercial. And this just reiterates the flexibility, but also when we talk about boosting redevelopment, it is along those transit corridors. It's downtown. It's the commercial, or it's the core commercial areas, is where we're really trying to focus a lot of those efforts, and will be focusing those efforts into the future. When we talk about industrial jobs, part of what we've said is let's go back and take a look at what are those key industries that we anticipate having some success with into the future. We've gone back to the JEO Economic Prosperity Plan. We've gone back to the Chamber of Commerce within the last year, did some work around a cluster analysis. And we wanted to say which of those have the strong likelihood of locating in this area, which of those are realistic, and then which are the kinds that actually have higher than average median income, so we can help close that gap. So we said based on that, based on the infrastructure that we have, and not just physical infrastructure, what are those key industries that we should continue to target or to target as we go forward? And so this then becomes the basis of industrial land needs. What this says here is what kind of sites do we need in order to support those key industries? And you can see along the left side, less than 10 acres, and they go in some increments all the way up to greater than 75 acres. With the exception of the first line, it's sites. The first line talks about jobs, and the reason why is we have lots of less than 10-acre sites within the existing community. It does translate to a number of jobs within the existing UGB. And so really, when you go all the way out to the right side, it gives a surplus of jobs. And we're actually going to use some of that surplus, or some of that surplus is used back when we start talking about addressing the commercial before. And so that surplus wraps back in that now allows us to say we have a commercial existing capacity within the urban growth current urban growth boundary to meet our commercial piece. So if you go down through this, we talk about sites 10 to 20 acres in size, and the next column says we need 15 of those sites. Within the existing UGB, we believe we can get 4 of those. Need to have new capacity inside. The UGB would be 6 of those, and then 4 of those. And those 4, to create that existing capacity, partial assembly will be an example of ways we need to get there. Try to be very proactive and aggressive in our brownfield remediation program. You might remember one of the strategies that I won't talk about here, but we talked about industrial land bank and creating a land bank, so that could help with creating new capacity inside the UGB. Based on all that, we said, okay, we still have a remaining need of 5, 10 to 20 acre sites. And you go down the list, and when you get all the way down to the bottom, we say we need 12 sites outside the current urban growth boundary. What I wanted, the next slide is going to show you what that means for acres, but I want to make one qualification before I show that to you, because what I'm going to show you, the 12 sites will translate into an approximate acres, but I want to say why that's approximate, because if you take a look at, if we need to have 2 20 to 50 acre sites, if we get a site that's 39 acres, another one that's 47, that equals a certain amount of acres. If we happen to get one that's 26 and another one that's 49, that's a different number of acres. And so the 12 sites will end up being specific on-the-ground sites, and so the total amount of acres is going to vary plus or minus. So I just want to put that out there as we go forward, because people are going to glom onto these numbers, but you just need to recognize that it's going to change. And so what we said is we want to consolidate brownfield cleanup of 4 sites in the UGB, which is about 60 acres or so, and then expand for plus or minus around the 475. And again, remember, I can't overemphasize, don't glom onto that specific number. It's a relative magnitude of that number, but don't glom onto 475. It could be 476 or it could be 474. You know what? See what I'm saying? So I'm trying to, you understand that, right?
You just said glom 3 times.
Now I don't have to attribute it to me anymore. And you've seen this before, so this shouldn't be new. What we've said is this a...
Yes.
Okay, press the next one.
This is...
Ooh, nice. Want to see that again?
I was making notes. What did I miss?
There it goes.
Miracle of technology.
Okay, cool.
What this says is, and you can see down in the legend there, take a look at making them as commercial or flexible employment designation. And so when we talk about meeting our commercial need, this is a piece of that, but it's also continually along these corridors and core commercial areas is where we want to focus commercial jobs. We also can focus some of our industrial jobs around there. And then we said this is where we recommend we expand. Our intent will be, that particular area is about 500 acres. Our intent will be is to be able to fit the 12 sites within that particular area up there.
Just by the airport, that's it?
Yeah. For all the reasons we've kind of talked through, and we can talk through some other of those as we go, but that's
And all
our
the houses
recommendation.
around your house.
Right.
I'm a little far, well, anyway.
So that's the recommendation on industrial.
I can't throw a rock.
Okay, let's move on to housing.
See it.
The key strategies, we've said we're going to meet our multifamily need inside the current UGB, again, so not expand the UGB to accommodate the multifamily housing piece. Want to increase variety, also redesignate within the current UGB. That's an important part of this strategy. Also remove infrastructure obstacles on current land that's inside the UGB to make that available, also to expand for single-family home, and then continue our affordable housing programs. Recommendation is a 55-45 mix, 15,000 homes. I'll show you. You've seen this before, so there's no new number on this, other than it's highlighted that shows what the actual recommendation is. There's been a lot of discussion around this. It's a policy choice on where you land. For the reasons we've talked about before, both on moving us forward a little bit differently where we've been, but not overstating that or overreaching, for me gets to the 55-45. as I've said all along, people can make very cogent arguments on any of those columns. But this is where I fall out, trying to balance affordable housing, trying to balance what I think is a realistic change over 20 years. So you've seen this before, so my recommendation is 55-45. With that, 94% of the total expected housing, again, will be inside the UGB. And so what that means is that, again, we've said we consciously want to move towards a compact urban development, and so that's part of what we're doing, but it's not all, can't all get contained in the UGB. You've seen this before, well, probably not on the multifamily side as much, but it's the same deal as we've talked about before. I want to take you all the way to over on the right side, that boost density and redevelopment of 1,600 homes. This is the multifamily side. Again, laissez-faire strategies won't achieve this. We're going to have to be very proactive in achieving or implementing strategies that allow us to increase density in multifamily homes, particularly along transit corridors and core commercial areas, if we want this to be successful and achieve what I believe the community is saying is we want this kind of vision as we move forward. At area planning for transit corridors and core commercial areas, we talk a little bit about it here, but that also has a key component when we talk about neighborhood livability. One of the real tension points is the development in that edge between what is generally more of a corridor versus what is more the local streets of a neighborhood, and we see that in various places. And when we get into neighborhood livability, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that is an important component of needing to do that. And then boosting redevelopment and average densities in some of these other places. Because remember, what we're not doing is adding more density into the neighborhoods. So it's got to go somewhere. And part of it is along these corridors, and some outside the UGB is going to have to occur. Single-family homes, you've seen this. I don't know if anything is brand new, but I think I want to highlight a couple things on this. One is when we talk about new capacity inside the UGB and you go over to the redesignation, that's 658, that's number of homes, and that'll translate into acres. And so from my perspective, what we're doing is we'll be creating acres for single-family homes that were not previously available to develop as single-family homes. A portion of that is through redesignation, a portion of it will be through UGB expansion, and a portion of it will be removing obstacles for infrastructure. And so we want to redesignate 236 acres for single-family homes. Improve infrastructure for other areas that are currently constrained or there are obstacles, and then actually expand for 350 acres. So what we're actually creating is 600 acres of new land that wasn't previously available for single-family homes. And the infrastructure area actually creates probably another 100 to 150 acres, but and part of that is putting those infrastructure improvements in our capital plan as we go through the transportation system plan and wastewater plans and things like that. And so, again, I want to emphasize from my perspective, what we're doing is creating land that was previously not available to develop a single-family home, some of it inside the UGB, some of it outside the UGB. This is also one of those.
It's magic.
So those are redesignated lands. Remember, that's 236 acres. Of redesignating those primarily from multifamily to single-family. Now, the one down on the left in the southwest, about 80% of that land will get redesignated as single-family. So that's actually a larger parcel. But combined total, it represents about 236 acres. And this is where we recommend we expand for single-family homes. There's about 250 acres up there on Bailey Hill, Gimble Hill Road, and the one up on Clear Lake Road is another 150 acres or so. And part of what we're trying to do there is create different building conditions. It's different to build on the northern piece as opposed to down the southern piece. Different characteristics.
You're going to cover the specifics of infrastructure improvement later?
We can. I'm not going to, but others can talk about that and answer any
Questions that
Yeah.
exist regarding that.
Yeah. So we walked through the pillars. You might remember climate change, energy resiliency. Important part of that is our 20-minute neighborhood planning for those and implementing those, and there's a variety of other things that we'll be doing. You've seen this map before. Matt McRae had come in one time and just talked a little bit about where we have 20-minute neighborhoods and where some other things need to be taken care of, and so part of that is what you see there. Our climate and energy action plan, we're want to move forward on that. These are just some of the goals coming out of that relate, as well as the rest of them relate. So none of this is new to what you're seeing. The emphasis is on we just need to move forward with it. Remote compact urban development. Again, we talked about no expansion for commercial multifamily. Really need to be working on the core commercial areas and corridors. Protect our neighborhoods from high-intensity uses. I talked about that in those friction zones. And compact development, conducting pilot projects. You've seen this. This is the map of what we talked about as transit corridors and core commercial areas. This is an example up in South Willamette of one of those area plans that's currently underway. A lot of work's been done with that, and really what the purpose of this is to continually create compact urban development, at the same time protect adjacent neighborhoods, and so there's a lot of work on how do we make those transitions, and so I think it's a good example of a pilot program. Walnut Station was probably a good example, similarly, of trying to accomplish some of those kinds of things as well. Neighborhood livability. We talked about no density increases in neighborhood beyond what's currently allowed. We're not looking to pile density back into the neighborhoods. Opportunity siting and infill compatibility standards are critical. We do recognize that even with current allowable densities, there are friction points in several neighborhoods, particularly against some of those transition zones, particularly in the neighborhoods around the university area and in the River Road Santa Clara area. And so our strategy is to have both of those. In fact, we've started on both of those, but to have those, the first ones out of the gate, to really go through some of this neighborhood area planning to try to reduce some of those frictions, even within what's currently allowed. The other piece with density in the current neighborhoods, as you know, our opportunity siting program, part of that is that there are some sites within neighborhoods which the neighborhoods also would be fine with adding some additional density that may not be on a commercial corridor in a commercial core area. And so we will continue to work with that program and identify any of those that are appropriate. And then expanding for parks in Santa Clara and the Bethel area. The Bethel School District has said they want to add 80 acres that they've already identified, so we would propose bringing that inside. The parks, we've also said we need to plan for some additional parks inside our UGB, but adding the 242 acres of parkland outside the urban growth boundary, and then there's part of that in Santa Clara Community Park, and another one's the Golden Gardens Community Park, and bringing both those in. So if you take a look at here, up on the upper left is the Golden Gardens and the Bethel School District, and then kind of straight away center on the map is up there where the Santa Clara Park would get brought in. Oh, there we go. Oh, yeah.
Oh, there.
There we go. And protecting, enhancing natural resources. We want to continue to maintain some of the progress that we made over the years and keep us going in the right direction with that. Just a couple of examples of things that we've been doing over the years. The rivers to ridges, you're familiar with that, but just wanted to remind you that we want to continue these kinds of efforts. The Willamette River Open Space Vision Plan was within the last 2 years or so that came to the council, and so we want to continue with those efforts. So all that's a part of that, protecting our natural resources. And then the seventh pillar is be adaptable and flexible. We need to come back on an ongoing monitoring and reporting system. Ours is a 5-year system. We talked about that last time, and it's a set system of monitoring certain indicators, being able to come back, review those, analyze those, make adjustments based on what happens. And we have certain assumptions built into the recommendations and strategies. If they're working, great. If there's things we need to come back and make adjustments to, then we want to be able to have a process for doing that in a thoughtful, deliberate way. And we showed you this last time just as data for the ongoing monitoring, and this will need to be a formal rather than sort of an ad hoc process, and so setting that up will be an important part of this. Quick summary, and again, I know I've said this already, but I just know everybody's going to glom on to numbers, and so I just want to say it again. Don't glom so tightly to a number that when it comes at 474 or 476, for example, all of a sudden there's concern about that. It's going to be very site-specific on what actually can be accomplished, but our intent is to implement that within that area that I showed you. I think this gets back to the aggressive but realistic and reasonable part. Our population increase over 20 years is about 20%. The recommendation is to add, it's about 3% to our UGB. And so if you think about that, we really are trying to implement what is the vision that's envisioned in Envision Eugene, as opposed to just focusing on a line on the map. When we talk about expansion areas, and Pat, you mentioned, we can go into infinite detail on any of those things, but we really are taking a look at providing housing affordability and how do we try to do that. Utilities has a major play in that. So, for example, up in the Crest Drive area, which was one of the areas that was initially thought about for expansion for single family, the cost of utilities is pretty high relative to the Bethel Gimble Hill area. Minimizing impacts to farmland. So when you think about expansion for industrial land, one of the areas that we talked about before was up in North Game Park area. There's some other issues around that, particularly around floodplains. But we're also trying to minimize impacts to what we think are prime farmlands, because that is a value to the communities as we move forward. Compatibility with surroundings and some of those kinds of things. And so we've tried to be thoughtful in making our recommendations. Legacy of livability actually was created in one of the earlier CRG meetings on some of the things that people really love about this community. We tried to honor that in both our recommendations for the vision, but also where we expand or move toward the kinds of things we've done. So we have tried to honor that and celebrate that as we go forward. Next steps. Open house, public forums, hearings, council work sessions, formal adoption process. Our plan is to come back to this council in May, and what we'll ask you to do is actually make your sort of proposed recommendation. That has to go into this formal adoption process, and the county and the state and all have to weigh in through that. There's a legal process that we have to follow, but our intent is for you to put out your final plan into that. We'll go through that process. Throughout, this is not in stone. My recommendation is my recommendation. people, as we work through the next couple months, there may be new things that we learn. If there's new things that we learn, we may incorporate them. There'll be new things that the council learns. You may choose to make changes however you choose to as we go through this process. And so, with that, we're out of time.
All right. Thank you, John. Excellent presentation. And I've got Mike and then George polling in the queue.
Mayor?
And Pat.
Thank you, Mayor, very much. First of all, obviously, thank you to John, to all the staff, to Lisa, to everybody who's worked so hard for so long. It's finally good to have, and especially all the volunteers, all the folks in the back of the room who spent so many hours trying to help make this a community project. Great work. You deserve to pat yourself on the back and know that it's a job well done. There are a couple of questions that are minor tweaks and things that I'd like to add or understand a little better so I can understand the most useful way to interact with this stuff when the time comes for the work session. So one of the things that you said is that you want to be able to, if there are a number of assumptions that are built into this, and if you want to be able to, if some of those assumptions don't pan out the way you expect, you want to be able to change this in a thoughtful and deliberative way. Okay? So one of those assumptions that I noticed is that we want to make sure that we're building higher amounts of density around transit corridors and redevelopment of commercial around transit corridors, which is part of the why we don't have any commercial acres in. So as I look at some of the areas that were shown in the map there, obviously West 11 jumps out as one of the largest areas of intended redevelopment. So we're intending intentionally to redevelop most of West 11. And my question is, if for any reason the MX project that we've talked about for so long doesn't occur on West 11, what's the effect on the assumptions, and how does that change what's going to happen with regard to planned commercial redevelopment, and how many acres, if you can, are we talking about? And what's the timeline if, for example, the MX project doesn't go through? What would be the timeline to change the reality of what we've created here?
I'll start at one level, then Lisa, her team can shift to another level. But the plan does, from my perspective, say to achieve compact urban development, what we want, we need to have a viable public transportation system, for lack of a better term for that.
We have a great bus system. Does that mean you intend the MX to go through?
I believe we need to have a viable, whether it's a bus rapid transit or something similar system, a network throughout the community.
Okay.
Because I think what that does is it supports what we're trying to accomplish through this vision.
Okay.
Now, any particular little segment of that, I'm not going to argue right now, that's a different conversation, but overall, the need for that kind of a system, I think, is needed to achieve the vision. As we go down through the years, if we're not achieving the densities, if we're not achieving the redevelopment, if we're not achieving the boosting of the redevelopment in any of those types of land uses, and we're monitoring that, and either the strategies we haven't implemented that we say we need to, or there's new strategies that would need to be implemented, then if the assumptions haven't panned out, then I think we need to take a look and say, okay, do we need to reevaluate our land need also?
Let me be clearer with my question. I appreciate your answer. This particular recommendation assumes we will build the MX out West 11. Is that correct?
No.
No?
It does not assume MX. Those are all our high-capacity existing transit corridors, as LTD has identified, as Transplant has relied on them. So, as we all know, I know you've had presentations about transportation, there are synergies around the higher form of transit that you have in place and land use. But these are already high-frequency transit corridors, so the more improvements we make, the better the synergies between land use and transportation, but we have not assumed MX.
Okay, great, thank you. The other question then is, I would love to get, and I don't know if we can do it all right now, but I would love to get a much more detailed report on what are the number of jobs created at 1.66 over 10 years as an assumption. What's the number at 1.4? What would it be at 1.75? How does that stack up against the kind of growth we would like to have within the next 10 years? To my way of thinking, I think we're undershooting that with 1.4, but that's a very, that's my personal opinion. So I'd like to know what that 10-year projection of the number of jobs created. In other words, if we're going to get out of this recession, what's our rate need to be? If we're going to get back to some semblance of normalcy that we had, or what was normal once upon a time with employment levels, what does it require of us so we have a good number to choose from? I appreciate the intelligence of what you put forward, but I'd like more details around that. And then lastly, with the site-specific aspect of that, I noticed that we're not taking advantage of the leveraging what the county is doing in the Goshen and Lcc Basin area, which I was kind of surprised not to see.
I think there's two pieces to that. One is, as we've talked before, and we do want to be good partners with the county around the Goshen conversation, and we will continue to be that part of that.
We're not adding any acres in that area.
The recommendation is not to add any acres in that. The Goshen area does not.
It's not contiguous.
Yeah, it's not contiguous. You can probably talk about why that's really a difficult area to bring into the UGB, but that doesn't mean we won't continue to work with Lane County around the Goshen area. Do you want to talk more specifically about?
The Goshen area, since it's not contiguous to our UGB, we can't add it into our UGB.
Right.
We would, if you imagine the kind of cherry stem you'd have to do to add it into our UGB. The statutory requirements are that we accommodate our need within our own urban growth boundary. We are committed to doing what we can to stimulate jobs in that area, and what that may do is, if it in fact comes to pass and we have folks that are working there, it may impact the number of jobs we still need. It could, if that's successful, we may find in 5 years or 10 years that we don't need as many jobs as we thought we did. But we physically can't add it to our urban growth boundary right now, and because there's no certainty that jobs will go there, we can't really count it into our current job need either. It's definitely one of those things that we want to watch and reconsider at these 5-year intervals, I would say.
George Poling?
Yeah, I may need a second round. John, thanks to you, the staff, and everybody, like Mike said, for all the hard work and all the many hours that went into this. And this is kind of like a halfway point, I think, in this whole process. And I think at the end of it, no matter where we land, I think the final product is going to be a fairly good product, and I'm looking forward to that day now. On one of the earlier slides, you made reference to protecting prime farmland, and I think that's a great idea. However, in some of the areas where we're looking at possibly expanding the urban growth boundary, I know there is some farmland in that area. At what point, are these farmlands, is there different classifications of farmlands in these areas, and at what point does it become not viable for the farmland to be continued farming if it's dedicated as prime farmland? How are we going to address that?
Do you want to?
I'll make myself clear.
Yeah. We talk about minimizing impacts to prime farmland. So, for example, we looked at a number of different expansion areas for industrial employment, one of them being in the Game Farm Road area. We decided that probably wasn't the best place to go because there were not only Class 1 and 2 class soils there, which is the definition of prime farmland, I believe, but also it's in the floodplain. There are some Class 1 and Class 2 soils in the Clear Lake Road area, but it's deemed to have less of an impact than in other areas. So we're trying to minimize our impacts on those soils to the greatest extent we can.
All right. And then on, I can't remember the slide number, it was on page 11, the top slide, where you discussed the keeping the industrial land and not changing it for another use. Will that need provide the trigger for us to take a relook at the inventories of lands? I agree, we need to protect the industrial sites for industrial sites, but if a need does arise, will that pull the trigger on the
I think if I understand your question, so for example, if we end up having a lot more commercial demand or even residential demand for what would have been designated as industrial lands, I believe that we would absolutely want to look at that, because what we're doing is we're establishing what we believe to be the needed supply, but if in doing our flexible and adaptable look-backs and monitoring, we find out that that's not the case, we'll have the opportunity to revisit that.
And then a couple of places you made reference to redesignating properties or lands. So if you redesignate it, you're talking like going from multifamily to single family or something of that nature. Is that going to cause a bubble effect? Is it going to be necessary to redesignate some property somewhere else? Or are we going to have to expand the urban growth boundary to make up for that redesignation? And
So the redesignations from medium-density residential to low-density residential, they're Metro Plan designations, and we have accounted for the loss of MDR in our MDR calculations, so that's already been factored into the math. Is that?
So the answer is there's not an unaccounted for bubble.
okay.
All the bubbles are accounted for as we go forward.
Okay, and then one last thing, the last slide where you have the, where we go? Quick. The flexible, thank you, the flexible implementation. We get to a certain point down the road, we realize that the numbers have changed, so the amount of land has changed, either plus or minus. Is it going to be a process that's a little less confusing and arduous as the one we're going through now?
I'm sorry, we're going to have to get started now. Yeah, that's our intent, and we'll work with the legal staff as well as there are some other community members, CRG members have an interest in this. The short answer for me is yes, I sure hope so, that we can all come to an agreement on let's make some objective measurements, and then when it comes back, it's a much less time process.
Well, I certainly hope so, because I can see a need arising to make an adjustment one way or the other, and then perhaps we'll miss out on, taking advantage of it. And, for example, say a big business wants to come in, or one of our local companies wants to expand. We need to make an adjustment. By the time we get through this type of a process we're doing now, something else happens and we lose that opportunity. I don't want to see that happen.
Pat, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. A couple of things. John, you said laissez-faire twice now. So you say it one more time and James Buchanan has to give it up, right? A number of things that I would say, but I'm not going to ask any detailed questions because I think you've given a great presentation. Like Councillor Clark, I'm more optimistic than the projections, the 1.4, and I'm more optimistic that we are going to need more land in the future because more people are going to want to relocate or expand their businesses here. We can talk about that at a different time. Looking at slide 3, the picture of the CRG, the Community Resource Group, and there's an interesting section on that which has Emily on one side, Lisa on the other, and me in the middle. And I'm looking right down there, and it's Emily on one side, Lisa on the other, and you in the middle. So that's,
You like to flank people.
Speak for yourself.
it's an amazing thing. But what I will say is that the CRG has done monumental work, and I will make another quote. Never in the history of all of Eugene and Lane County have so many owed so much to so few. When the next generation looks back on their work, surely they will say this was their finest hour. And it really has been a monumental task. Yeah.
We need
Who likes Churchill? Who likes Churchill? But you had mentioned infrastructure improvements, and we've talked about that with a red light flashing ad nauseum, excuse me. And clearly we have to build roads before a lot of these sites can be developed. Significantly, as we look down the list of slides that you presented, pillar number 7 really jumps out as the one that needs to be emphasized here. You've done a lot of due diligence, and the CRG and the subgroups have done a great deal of due diligence in preparing what you were able to give us today. Cannot commend staff enough for the perseverance and the slings and arrows that they've had to endure throughout this process, and there have been slings and arrows throughout this process. But Pillar 7 is significant in that It states that we have to be adaptable and flexible, and it has to be a formal, not an ad hoc process that you suggested. And I really hope and believe that after 5 years, as we go through this process, once we start implementing the points that you have made and we start making the adjustments that you've suggested, that after 5 years we're able to make adjustments based upon whatever changes between now and then. And I'm not suggesting that we start at 5 years. I'm suggesting that you, as I expect and as I know you're going to do, keep track of things so that at 5 years we can take a real strong look at the formal process or quasi-formal process that's taken up to us up to that 5-year process. And we look back and we say, this worked, this didn't work, this could be better, and we make the adjustments that I believe that you will be able to help us to make after that 5-year process. So once again, thank you very much. It's been a remarkable process, and it's all of our finest hour.
So I've got Andrea, then George Brown, and then Alan, and then Chris. So, Andrea.
I don't know if I can follow that, Pat. I would really like to give a round of applause to everybody who worked on this, because I think the city did a fabulous job. And I'm just so impressed with the amount of work that has come out. A lot of this kind of takes my breath away. I really don't have anything specific to say. I'm glad to see some things happening in the Bethel neighborhood as far as the parks go and the schools. I think that's really good. Glad to see that there's a lot of emphasis on the transit corridors. I think that really is where a lot of the work should go. I think of Highway 99, and I think of that is a brownfield waiting to be redesignated and really put some effort into. So I'm hoping that people can take advantage of that. That's about all I have. Thank you.
George Brown.
Thank you. I've got some questions about, on page 11, about the projected job growth. The 35,800 jobs, that's a 20-year projection?
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay, and our population is going to grow 34,000. So is there an estimation of how many of those 34,000 people are going to be workers? I'm just wondering which way you approach that figure in the center. Like, say, maybe 22,000 workers?
You mean of the population growth?
Yes, the population growth.
The population growth and the economic forecasts actually are two separate things. So you don't derive the number of jobs from understanding how many people are coming into the area. They're kind of done through different methodologies entirely. So we can certainly look at demographic trends, but there isn't a real close tie between the two.
Yeah, I'm not questioning the accuracy of the figure. I guess I'm just trying to understand how it was derived at, because there's different ways you can do it. I mean, I realize all those jobs are not going to be people that live in Eugene. They're going to live in Springfield, Coburg, Junction City, Veneta, Creswell, so on. I get that part of it, but I just, conversely, so a lot of the people that are going to be moving to Eugene aren't going to work in Eugene. A certain percentage of them are going to be working in Springfield or, Junction City and so on. I mean, I know a lot of people that already do that. So, okay. Then I got a couple of questions about the Clear Lake Road, the farm soils, if we could maybe remind us. I mean, we may have it in our, what previous packet, but if we could just get a reminder of how many acres are Class 1 and Class 2. And then I'm kind of the same thing about the proposed industrial expansion, that kind of L-shaped purple side up there, and that's just north of Clear Lake Road. I imagine there's probably a fair amount of Class 1 and Class 2 soils there, too. So if we could get a reminder on that. I guess that's about it. Thanks.
Alan?
So I'll add my voice to the chorus of folks thanking everybody. John, in particular, great presentation. I didn't know you do PowerPoint so well. But really, your vision and leadership around this has been stellar, which is why we hired you. And thank you. You exceeded my expectations. And Lisa and your team did a fantastic job over the time to get this accomplished in the amount of time that you actually did. It's a really study in perseverance if anybody wants to take it up in sociology. And then all the people that are in the CRG and the TRG in particular, all those hours, that's really, as the mayor likes to say, we have a very engaged community. And, but that's what makes Eugene a very, very special place, I think. I won't take up time too much about specifics, asking responses. I'll just kind of give you a list of things that I want to talk about as we move forward, because this is the first of many meetings. There was a red box in a lot of the multi-box things. I didn't quite understand each one of those. I want to talk about the possibility of incorporating the airport into the UGB. There were some issues around our ability to do things at the airport because it wasn't in the UGB, and it wouldn't make any difference to development because you can't develop it at all. So it's really just, and it is contiguous now. So I want to talk about that. I also wanted to talk about the LCC Basin and Goshen and how that integrates, and the information we got from LCC about their plans and how that ends up working into this potentially. I've been talking about Envision Eugene 2 phases. This is phase 1. Phase 2 is the implementation, doing all those things, and I was glad to see that the university neighborhood whole thing is going to be one of the first things we do. We've queued it up for you. They're ready, willing, able, engaged, and I'd really like to see that the idea of an overlay zone for the university area be a pilot about how we can change things, that we don't have to do cookie cutter for the entire city. We can be specific, and because very regions have very specific things that pertain to their way that they are going to develop. On the industrial lands, I'm very interested in storages. How do you protect those lands and keep them industrial and for that intended purpose? Just zoning them can be changed. So I like that it's in one area. I think it's the right area. It's probably more acres than I thought was necessary. A little bit more of chasing the golden ring than meets my taste, but I think there's so much in there that I don't think we're going to have a problem about not having people there. And then I want to talk about flexibility and also the methodology for how you got to jobs and homes, number of homes.
Okay, Chris.
Thank you. I could say great work, but you've already heard that, and it is, and you certainly are deserving of it. I don't want to go into detail as the others don't about the specific content, because you need time to absorb. There's a lot here, and it's really good stuff, and I do want to absorb it. So what I want to focus on were those portions of it that really resonated with me. I think probably if I had to pull one word out, it would be balance, because I do think that is the component that's most critical here. We do have a community that represents many different perspectives and many different elements, and I think finding the balance really is important here. To some, balance means there's something in here for everyone to not like. The other side says balance is there's something in here for everyone to find resonance with and works for them. If you were to appoint me king, I will make this happen in 2 days. And so if you're looking for fast, that's the fast way to do it.
Do we need a nomination?
But I know that would not be the wise way to go. And balance would not say that was the wise way to go. So for what I wanted to focus on were how this can help me with my ability to approach this decision. And there's really 3 things that I always use when I approach a decision. The first one is what's the principle at play here? I always need to figure out what is the fundamental principles at work. And I realize oftentimes there's good principles that compete, so I need to get clear on that. And I think the pillars are a good way to do that. And I think there's a lot of elements in here that represent what are the founding principles that we need to align ourselves with. The second one is what are just the practicalities that we have to realize, and that's your current reality is that we can wish for whatever we want to wish for, and wishes are good. I think wishes are great, but at some point we have to be grounded in reality, what from a practical standpoint is possible to do. And I think that requires a lot of folks to provide input on what they perceive the practical elements to be. And then the last one is, what is the process you're going to use to try to get here? And is it a process with integrity? Is it a process that people can be confident in? And that's the part I wanted to finish up with, because oftentimes a long and involved and participatory process is really the one that, in the end, will be the one that is the most solid. And you can build a quick process, but people won't believe in it. It ultimately won't have confidence. I know this took a long time. Elements of it will continue to take a long time, but that's the only way to build a firm foundation on which I can be comfortable and the community can be comfortable making a decision. So what I'm giving you right now is how much you've done so far, what you've managed to accomplish, and how that will help me, I think, is exactly what I'm looking for. You've given me, I think, a reality that I can appreciate. You've given me some fundamental principles that I can align with, and I can see, and I can believe the community aligns with. And maybe the most important part is I can see a process that I think will have confidence and integrity in the end.
So I'm going to make a few comments here. I really, really appreciate the effort for a different, more inclusive, more productive conversation. That's sort of been a thing that I've cared deeply about in everything we do, and this has been a sort of a stellar exercise, and I really appreciate it. And I think it's really important to our community. I think no matter what level of government you look at now, people like to see people working together and trying to find their common purpose and their common direction. I do think we've struggled for what is our future, and this is a chance for us to look at that. And I think we've gone, and I appreciate the fact that we've gone far beyond what the state required us to do, that this council tried to take all of our planning processes and pull them in and look at everything together. I think the pillars are a reflection of our community. I guess one of my biggest concerns is I heard Ed say when we came in that, that we're heading to the fourth inning, or whatever it was. Is that right? The fourth quarter. Fourth quarter. Fourth inning.
Ninth inning.
Great metaphors. Anyway, fourth quarter.
Inning,
thank
time
you.
to punt.
Yeah. Anyway, my point is that when you go through these kind of engagement processes, how you get into the very end is probably the most arduous work you have to do, and the most careful work, and what really will make the difference. So I think what the city manager has said, that we're close, but there's still more that has to happen here. And so trying to figure out how to get to that end, you got to get to an end sometime, but try to do it in a way that doesn't let up the focus here at the very end is really, really important. And I'm actually really proud of the fact that council and our staff and everyone has been focused on the triple bottom line, and you see it throughout the whole thing, the community livability and the community well-being. That seems really important to all of us, and that's definitely here. Basing our recommendation on facts and information and the kind of work that the subcommittee has spent so much time on, keeping our neighborhoods in focus, because if you were at those CRG meetings, you know that what's happening in our neighborhoods is just a passion and concern for so many in our community. I don't know how fast we're going to be able to make things happen, and that's a concern to me, is how fast we'll be able to do the things that we want to do. And I did want to mention that as you look at the clusters, we want to try for our economic development, that one of the things that Portland and others have found is that the fewer clusters you have, the more you'll be able to focus. I don't know if we've got too many on our list or not. There are many interests, but if you really want to hone in something, you have to kind of narrow it down. And the monitoring is really important too. I've got 4 of you in the queue, and we have 5 minutes. So, Mike.
Pass.
All right, George Poling.
Just a real quick request to follow up on George's request about the class of farmlands. And this gets back to what you were saying about the number of acres. I'd also like to know what the constraints are on all those lands. How much the acreage and how much usable or buildable land there is.
Wetlands.
Yeah, wetlands or whatever the constraints might be. Thank you. That's
Pat.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll condense what I had to say, assuming that everybody wrote down what I said earlier.
It's not written down, it's in a book.
We don't.
No, I just would like to echo Councillor Zelenka regarding the UGB and the airport, because that would, if my map reading is correct, that would actually make our UGB touch Junction City's UGB.
And then you can really throw rocks.
Okay, Alan?
Just the last one I didn't get to was about the flexibility, and I think we have one of the things I want to do in the early part of that jobs uncertainty is not make 20-year irrevocable decisions that we would get to. So we would create these lines that we knew were going to be wrong, and so we talked about urban reserves, and there's some legal problems with that. And I think that's a flaw in the law and the way that we do it, and it's 30, 40-year-old thinking. So I want to have a conversation about how do we do sustained orderly development in these areas, which is, and sustained orderly development means cost-effective development, especially with regard to utilities, and how do market forces help in getting that done, and what policies and incentives do we need to do to make sure that it gets done. So you don't develop the parcel that's out furthest away first. You do it like that. That makes more sense to me, and how we might work that into the 5-year look back on a regular basis.
We're under the line. Can you believe that? Okay, well, again, thank you very much for a great presentation and a great effort on the part of everyone, and now keep going. Thank you.
Onward. Yeah.